Welcome, everybody. I'm Jason Baumgartner with Suds Creative. I'm here with Chris Moriarty with Suds Creative, and we're bringing back DataBytes. You may have seen this series when we published a few of these, about 8 of these during the COVID pandemic. And we did that with DRB, with the help of Dan Pittman, CEO of DRB. We have taken this on, and basically with the resurgence of COVID-19 in several states around the country, we decided to dive back into this information and share with you what we're seeing. So let's get started. First of all, we're going to take a national look and take a look at the trends that we're seeing overall across the country. And to do that, we've actually looked at wash volume from sites in all 50 states. And we've taken about 1,000 different locations and we've averaged those out by state, so to get a good idea of what's going on in each state and what's going on nationally trends-wise. Then we'll talk about some of those trends, and we'll hand it over to Chris. Chris is going to take us through the national map, and we're going to talk about things like how weather has affected volume and how COVID-19 has affected volume. Then we'll do a state-by-state kind of discussion about key states, what's interesting and what's been in the news, and certainly how that's affected wash volume. And in some states, we're actually surprised to see that volume has not dropped, even though they're getting hit pretty hard with that COVID-19. So, and then we'll pass it over to Chris again. We'll talk consumer sentiment. So we'll take a look at what consumers are talking about and how consumers are feeling specific to car washes and then in general. Well, here it is. This is the national information week by week. You can see week 27 there. In the orange is 2020, the blue is 2019. Only about a 5% dip over where we were in 2019, but you can see a steady decline over the last 3 weeks, and that's a little concerning. Now, it certainly hasn't affected everybody, and we'll jump into that when we look at the maps and take a look state by state. But overall, not too bad. We were doing really good, rocking and rolling there when it felt like the states were opening up. You can see this nice trajectory after we hit the bottom, back in week 14, and everything's been going pretty good. In the last three or 4 weeks or so, we've seen a pretty sharp decline, and but we'll talk about how that looks region to region. Chris, what do you see on this map that jumps out at you?
Well, I think the funny thing was, as we were kind of setting back up to do more of these episodes, our whole plan was to kind of broaden the conversation, bring more people in, talk about general wash business beyond just the data. And when everything started changing between kind of the civil unrest, the COVID resurgence, we have to respond to the questions we're getting. So a lot of people were trying to, again, see around the corner, how's this going to affect my region? And so as we looked at this and saw that dip, what you're going to see as we go through all these slides is it always boils down to uncertainty. So when uncertainty starts to go up, we're going to see things get a little bit shaky. But if we look back just about COVID specifically, we've seen this before now. So our theory, our projection was that we're going to see basically a mini version of what we saw the first time around. Or before, everyone was like, what does this even mean? Or what does it mean to me? And I was like, okay, it's happening again. I think I know how this is going to affect me personally, but I'm not entirely sure. So as it evens out, our expectation would be a very, very similar dip and resurgence in just a much shorter time frame.
Shorter time frame, and what about the velocity of the dip or the length of the dip?
So the whole thing, if we look, and as the weeks go by, it's not going to go down as far. It's going to come back up sooner. Where we knew it took several weeks before for us to people to really get an understanding of what the new world looked like. And I think now, as people are living with the resurgence for a little while, they're going to go right back up into that kind of right back up on the trajectory where we were headed.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Chris, this is a map. This is an interesting study on color and geography. Why don't you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because we always think about the United States as kind of one whole unit, but given just how wide our just the straight up geography is, if you compare that to Europe, where Washington could easily be Britain and Florida would already be somewhere over in the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, it's so wide and diverse that the first thing we always look at, of course, is weather. knowing that there are huge weather patterns that can be affecting entire regions that aren't affecting others. So will that explain some of the dips that we see? And in this case, as you'll see when we drift to the weather map, that's it. That's exactly what happened in large part. The exceptions to that would be where there are the most people who would potentially be affected by, say, the resurgence of COVID or whatever it might be, where the populations of Arizona and Florida, we know a lot of snowbirds down there, retirement communities, populations specifically sensitive to COVID, and of course the people that care for those people. So it ripples out. So we would expect to see that manifesting in those states aside from weather. But given what we just talked about before, we know that that is more than likely a temporal condition. And in fact, in more pocketed regions of Florida, like Orlando, we were getting calls saying, hey, should we change strategy? Should we do something different? And we looked and we saw the whole state was holding back. And we said, this is something that is unilaterally happening. Don't change anything. Hold the course. And it did come out on the other side and it did rebound. So when we look at these things, we try not to be reactionary. We're trying to say, am I doing something wrong? Is there something I need to change? Do I need to be offering more discounts or something crazy? This is where we want to go back to the data and say, is this temporal? Is this going to be long-standing? Is this weather? And really just make sure that we're keeping stress as low as possible.
So talk to us, this is week over week, right? So what we're looking at right here, this is a percentage change from week 26 to week 27.
Exactly.
Tell me about the Northeast, because we're not talking about COVID necessarily in the Northeast, are we?
Nope. That is, again, because when we look at what's affecting, because New York's such a great example, because everyone knows there's a big difference between New York State and New York City. So often within that specific population, those averages are going to kind of wash out what the rest of the state is doing. Where in the Northeast, that specific region, which is not as densely populated, when you see a trend that is that wide and that heavy hitting, you know it's one thing, and it's severe weather.
Yep.
And that's exactly what we found. And it totally made sense, but also we know that that's temporal. And knowing that this time of year, having spent a number of summers in Maine, I can tell you they got some summer fun, some storms that'll come through there, and yeah, everyone just hangs tight for a little while.
Nice. And then you look at, let's take a look at state by state. There are a few states that have really taken some big dips over the last 4 or 5 weeks. Arizona is certainly one of them, and probably the most exaggerated of the examples that we'll show. You can look at and see where they were in week 20, and since then it's been a really steady decline all the way down below 1,000 washes per site on average. Idaho, very similar, and you can see kind of the fits and starts. And this is what kind of concerns me a little bit with consumer confidence, is the more we go up and down, like, hey, we're out of it, and then we come back into it again with a resurgence. The more that we do that, I feel like people are going to be a little bit wary of how long it's going to take to actually get out of COVID-19. So that's something to look at as well, and definitely will show up in consumer sentiment, right?
Oh, 100%. And what's interesting about Idaho is when you looked at the initial COVID impact, there were states like Washington's a great example of one of these states, Seattle, getting hit hard early on. And then you had other states that followed and had these pockets. And with the resurgence, it's sort of these new places like Idaho that are leading the country in these infection rates, in Texas and some of these other places where it would make perfect sense that they're going to be exceptionally sort of impacted. Sure. Being that, well, wait a minute, this isn't supposed to happen here. This is supposed to happen in those places where it happened the first time. And Arizona makes sense just from that population standpoint. But I firmly believe that because of the fact that they've seen what happened to other states first, that the resurgence should be faster than what people will expect. Mm-hmm. And it'll look just like a mini replication of what we saw the first time around.
Well, it's a great segue to talk about Florida and Texas in particular. So looking at Florida, you can see, again, the blue is 2020, the orange is 2019. Really, Florida and Texas have been hit with a resurgence of COVID-19, but haven't necessarily taken a volume hit at all. In fact, they're actually a little bit above. Texas did take a little bit of a dip in week 26, quite a bit of a dip, but they've certainly bounced back. And maybe that goes to what your point was earlier about the the comeback on the second wave should be a lot faster, and the dip should be a lot smaller.
Because ultimately, people are going to, we've said this since week one, it boils down to behavior. People are always going to ask, and I know this sounds self-serving, but it's just human nature, is how is this situation going to affect me? If I don't see it or feel it affecting me specifically, I'm going to return to my normal behaviors a lot sooner. So with Texas, again, going back to that geography from Houston to Dallas to San Antonio, I
Sure.
mean, in other places, you would have crossed state lines.
Hmm.
And so there is, with some of that pocketing, anybody who's been to those, even though Texas itself has this huge culture, each one of those cities has independent cultures as
Sure.
well. So you're going to see a lot of offsetting that's going to go on in a state like that. Plus, you look at that general economy as it relates to political unrest. People in Texas are feeling good because as companies all over are throwing their hands up and they're saying, hey, you know what? We're out of here. Where are they going? They're going to Texas. So, I mean, we would expect that sentiment, that badge of honor, like whatever that might be, it's going to lift people through a lot of economic or biological situations that would have affected other states more dramatically.
That's a good point. I was on a call a couple weeks ago with some leaders in the Boise area and business leaders, and they were talking about an influx specifically from the economic partnership of companies and interest in states like California, specifically the Bay Area, where they're
Mm-hmm.
looking to potentially go to a city where they could have mitigate a little bit of that risk from COVID-19 if it does stick around. So I think you're exactly right, absolutely right. Looking at areas that will be tougher, that have higher density, and moving to the Idahos, the Wyomings, to get away from
Mm-hmm.
that and be a little bit more insulated from potentially the economic fallout from another pandemic. Great point.
And like we've always said, the way people feel about a situation is actually more important predictably than the reality of a situation. And as we pull this sentiment filter up here, I mean, we watched this from the beginning where people were overwhelmingly positive
Mm.
about the quarantine early on, and as the weeks went on, we saw it march backwards to where, again, is the danger real? Well, obviously, but it doesn't determine necessarily how we react to it. So when people are just burned out on something and they said, you know what, I don't care. What's going to happen is going to happen. We're going to go back out. But our mission and our calling to all of our clients and people we work with is just match the sentiment of your area. If they're frustrated, be frustrated. You can still grow your business and do that. But we always look at this for that confidence because, again, when you drill down to another level, there's different types of frustration that you can be frustrated, or as Jason likes to put it, when you're challenged, often you rise up. Whereas if you're defeated is when you give up and that's when you really want to get worried. That's why when you see all these blue words around here, they've got a lot of different sort of connotations to them, where tense and nervous versus bored and depressed. Hey, when I'm tense, or nervous about something, that often leads to action. Where if I'm depressed or unhappy, it leads to inaction. So we're always looking for how's this going to reflect or how's this going to manifest in terms of behavior.
Now this is very fluid, correct?
Oh yeah, in fact, what's amazing is when you put this on a timeline, even as it relates to periods of the day,
Mm.
people, when you look, it's amazing and it's like clockwork. People are overwhelmingly more positive in the early hours versus the later hours, towards the end of the week and on the weekends versus on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. I mean, it's you hate to say it's almost too obvious or too stereotypical to be true, but it is in terms of like the way that people operate. People are happier on Fridays. People are happier in the mornings. Then it's so as you time your messaging out to your clients and otherwise, you can really take advantage of some of these tools.
That's great. Well, let's look at specifically car wash sentiment. This looks a lot different than the last slide we looked at.
Well, and this is something that I was actually pretty thrilled as we look for chatter in social media about car washes specifically. I mean, it makes sense. There's not going to be a ton of it usually. So you get a few data points here and there, probably from operators themselves trying to promote their businesses. So as we're kind of coming back and as we look at a lot of data right after July 8th and then going up towards the end of the month tends to be kind of the second wave after the spring of activity at car washes. But look at the chatter. And as you can see, some of those circles are very dense and some of them are bigger than others. This is the most direct car wash conversation on social media I've ever seen taking place. So that is a huge bellwether for the industry and a huge sign to hit the gas. And again, watch your tone, because you can hit the gas if your area is frustrated or timid or whatever it is. Just match that tonality, but don't back off the intensity, or the being intentional with still getting your message and your presence felt out there.
Great point. All right. Well, let's talk about what's coming. We just got another batch of data today. And so we'll be shooting tomorrow or Wednesday and trying to publish another one of these by Thursday or Friday of this week. And then next week, we're really excited. On Tuesday next week, we're going to release, we had shot an episode about a month ago with Bill Martin in our office, in studio, so to speak, at our Suds office in Boise, Idaho. And we talked about, what does this world look like, this car washing world post-COVID. He had some great operator tips and management tips. We were supposed to shoot 45 minutes, ended up being an hour and a half and more. So we're very excited to release that. We'll probably release that in 2 parts. But that'll come Tuesday next week on the 21st. Otherwise, Chris, any last thoughts before we sign off?
Just light up that comment box. We get so many different questions throughout the day. Like, the worst thing we can do is assume what you need to hear right now. So ask us questions, because we're here to lend that transparency and help people guide their businesses. So tell us what's happening. Tell us what you're thinking. Tell us what you're seeing, you're curious about. And that's why we're doing this.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.